everybody to today's Restoring the Sciences webinar. Our topic today is oikophobia, which translates literally to fear or loathing of one's home. Home, in this case, of course, includes not only one's physical surroundings, but a civilization's cultural roots and traditions. Our guest today is Dr. Benedict Beckeld. He's a philosopher and historian who published a fascinating book last year with the title Western Self-Loathing, Oikophobia and the Decline of Civilizations. Before we introduce our guest, let me tend to a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is sponsored by the National Association. I'm Director of Science Programs there. One of the reasons we run this webinar is to give you, the audience, the opportunity to interact with our guests. We'll have a discussion between ourselves for about 45 minutes, after which we'll open up the floor to questions. And I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We can also handle questions in the chat, of course, but we prefer Q&A because it's a little bit more interactive. And also, you don't really need to wait until we open up the floor for questions. You can submit your questions there at any time. And again, I encourage you to do so. Okay, on to our speaker. Benedict Beckeld is a philosopher, and he has deep interest in political philosophy, contemporary culture, and the philosophy of history. He has an eclectic academic pedigree, including stints in Germany, France, and Italy. And he and I also have a common connection through the remarkable country of Namibia, where much of my research career was spent, and where, after completing his doctorate, Benedict did a year-long volunteer stint as a teacher in one of the Herero towns there called Ojumbindi. You can look it up if you like. Following that experience, he took on a position as professor of philosophy, Greek, and Latin at the American University of Paris. And in 2014, he left that position and returned to the U.S., where he is concentrating presently on writing and other means of communications, including the philosophy vlog. And I'll be putting some links into the chat box about all this, so you can link to those there. All right, so without further ado, Benedict, welcome to Restoring the Sciences. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
So I think it might be good if you could give us a brief outline of the content of your book on Western self-loathing and the rise of oikophobia.
Yes, so it's a fairly eclectic book, you might say, as indeed reflecting my own eclectic background. But basically, the book is about the phenomenon of cultural self-hatred that we have today. The term oikophobia itself was coined by the late British philosopher Roger Scruton. And he wrote an article or two about it, an article in a small book chapter about the topic about oikophobia in the West after World War II, and about how he noticed, and certain other intellectuals as well have noticed, that the West is beginning to become more and more self-hating. And so what I did was I took that idea, or that not so much the idea, which I think was evident to many of us, but certainly the term, which I thought was a very useful term, basically the polar opposite of xenophobia. So xenophobia, one hates the foreigner, and oikophobia, one hates one's own home or one's own culture. And I realized when I thought about this term that this is something that is recurring in Western history. It's not just after World War II, although also after World War II. But I realized that this is something that happens to many cultures cyclically as they begin to decline. And I realized that through my previous study of various civilizations and their literatures and philosophies and so on, I realized that this is something that had already started in ancient Greece. And we then see traces of it in Rome and in earlier Western empires, France, Britain, and so on, and now in the United States, and of course in the West as a whole. And so in the book, Western Self-Contempt, the subtitle is Oikophobia and the Decline of Civilizations. And the decline is important because the decline is a big part of the argument. That is to say that this Western self-contempt doesn't just appear at any time in a civilization. It appears specifically as the civilization begins to decline. And so in the book, I lay out in a series of historical chapters what historical circumstances have to be given for oikophobia to be able to develop. And I use ancient Greece, Rome, France, Britain, and the United States as case studies. So you could say the book has a historical part and a philosophical part. So that's the historical part. In the philosophical part, I examine not just the historical circumstances, but specifically the philosophical arguments and the philosophical reasoning that was employed in order to justify cultural self-hatred. Not always wittingly, of course. People who hated their own culture, who despised their own culture, wouldn't necessarily have expressed it that way themselves. But we see traces of this, and we see how oikophobia develops as a type of relativism, and we also see how oikophobia develops as a type of positivism, the opposite of relativism. But so we have different sort of philosophical branches of cultural self-hatred, and so I lay out those as well in the book. And so ultimately, the book is you could say a philosophical, historical look at what makes oikophobia possible and why we have oikophobia. I think it's worth pointing out that lots of people have noticed that we have oikophobia. It's fairly common among a certain class of journalists and pundits and so on to always point out the fact that we're self-hating, but one doesn't really find a clear philosophical and cultural anthropological attempt to really explain why this is the case. And that's what my book sets out to do from a philosophical, historical, and cultural anthropological perspective. We could even say a word that is much better known than oikophobia today is woke or wokeism. And wokeism, I don't use that word so much in the book because I wrote the book in 2016, 2017. It took a while to get published because there was quite a bit of academic resistance to it, as one can imagine. So by that time in 2016, 17, the word woke wasn't so common, but I do mention it once or twice. But basically the sort of wokeism, or what's called wokeism, that we see today is essentially the most modern manifestation of oikophobia. So oikophobia is sort of the broader term of cultural self-hatred, and then that will express itself in certain different ways in different civilizations, but there are always certain commonalities that are there, stretching from our time all the way back to ancient Athens. And so that's essentially the book answers the big question of why all of this happens. So
the most interesting aspect of the argument that you outline is you take a fairly, well, you don't bring a pejorative cast to the terms xenophobia and oikophobia. For example, you make the point that xenophobia, that is suspicion of strangers or dislike of strangers, is actually the mark of a civilization in embryo almost. That this is an essential part in the emergence of civilizations. And the other intriguing part of it was that you mentioned that oikophobia, the seeds for the emergence of oikophobia are actually sown, if you will, by the success of xenophobia. That is a society that is xenophobic in the neutral sense and results in the emergence of a civilization that actually sets up the conditions for the emergence of oikophobia. And so it's almost kind of a self-destructive, and of course this leads to this notion that there's a natural life cycle of civilizations. I wonder if you could expand on this notion that xenophobia can actually be a positive, positive, I don't want to get into value judgments, an essential aspect of the emergence of great civilizations.
Yeah, no, but yeah, you're certainly right. But yeah, I don't use positive or negative so much, indeed, as you just said. That's actually something for which I've been criticized, because we live, obviously, as everyone knows, we live in politically quite polarized times. That's become a cliche, but a cliche for a good reason. It happens to be true. And so everybody wants a sort of warrior for their own cause. And so even though I've been criticized mostly from the left, I sometimes receive critique from the right as well, saying that I'm not sufficiently strident in my condemnation of the left, or that I'm not, that there's too much nuance for their liking, not conservative enough, or as the case may be. But that is really the point. I'm trying, although, I mean, I don't hide what I think about certain things. I don't believe that, which is actually also something I talk about specifically in the book. I don't think, certainly in the humanities and social sciences, that we can be completely free from bias. That's an illusion. So I don't pretend to be to not have an opinion on the matter, but I do try to be disinterested and not so much to condemn or to condone, but rather just to describe and to explain. And that's really much of what the book is about. And once one has that attitude, one can speak openly about things like xenophobia and oikophobia without feeling that one constantly has to sort of say sotto voce that this is bad or this is good. So xenophobia is, as you say, it's not that it's a good thing, but it is a quote unquote natural thing that civilizations go through. And that's oikophobia is a natural thing as well, because we see how often it happens. But the sort of basic posture of a society, of a civilization, is, of course, to be self-promoting and to be suspicious of outsiders. And then as the civilization spreads itself and comes into contact with other peoples and in some cases absorbs those other peoples, it naturally becomes more, it naturally becomes less hostile and friendlier to those other civilizations or to those other peoples. And so what was a process of xenophobia leads naturally into the oikophobic state. And that is the internal contradiction of oikophobia, that it hates that to which it owes its own success, right? A civilization hates that to which it owes its own success. Because in order to become oikophobic, a civilization has to have reached, and this is again something I talk about cyclically, that these are some of the historical circumstances that are prerequisites for oikophobia. A civilization has to have achieved wealth, leisure, victory over external enemies, so that there is a degree of peace and security. Once the civilization has those things, it can then turn inward and sort of start looking at itself, because it doesn't identify a common external enemy anymore, but becomes more solipsistic, and that enables oikophobia. And so a society that has not achieved those things, that has not become successful, that has not vanquished outside odds, does not become oikophobic. And that's something one sees very clearly in history. And yeah, so because we all, and that's also a little bit the psychological aspect of oikophobia, which is that we all require some sort of antagonist against which to measure ourselves, or by which to define ourselves. And when we all have external enemies, of course, that antagonist is very obvious. When those enemies have been vanquished, then the own society becomes the antagonist.
Yeah. There are lots of examples of xenophobic societies out there, and of course, I'm thinking of groups like the American Indians, for example. They're very xenophobic, and not to ride on the backs of this horror that's going on in Israel right now, but the Palestinians are also a very xenophobic society, and so it's not the case that xenophobia automatically is going to set the seeds for the emergence of a civilization. What's getting in the way of the emergence of civilization from those points of view?
Yes. So yeah, no, xenophobia itself is, as you say, it's certainly not a sufficient prerequisite. What's getting in the way of those societies that you mentioned is that some of the other prerequisites of oikophobia is a relatively free intellectual space. Because in order for oikophobia to develop, you have to have a space in which intellectuals can engage in their craft, can engage in self-study and self-critique without fear of the powers that be, without fear of the government or the church or what have you. And so this is the main reason why oikophobia is mainly a Western malady. Because we have had these things more than non-Western civilizations. It does happen a little bit. You can find it here and there in history, non-Western civilizations where they did have a reasonably free, open intellectual space and a degree of democratization. But since we have these so much more, we have oikophobia here in the West so much more as well. There has to be a level of so not necessarily full democracy, but there has to be democratization and at least a degree of egalitarianism, because that's how one can really have the free intellectual space in which to study oneself as compared to other civilizations. If there is this absolute aristocratic conviction that we are the best and that's all there is to it, and egalitarianism is nonsense, of course, one is not going to lapse into oikophobia because it's assumed that we are the best, our class and our civilization and so on. So a degree of egalitarianism, a degree of democratization, and an open intellectual space are parts of the prerequisites of Oikophobia. And obviously they don't have that, well, certainly not in the Palestinian territories. It would be a joke to suggest that they do, but yeah. So.
Yeah. It's an interesting, well, Islam presents a whole number of interesting case studies in this. In the case of Islam, of course, this was at a time when Europe and Western thought was in decline, that ended up being preserved in amongst Arab thinkers, and at least in the first few centuries of the emergence of Islam, that seemed to be a very vigorous intellectual space going on. The kind of things that you're describing, a kind of self-confidence and whatnot. And what I'm uncertain about is the extent to which freedom of thought and freedom of inquiry were respected in those early Islamic societies. And if not, then how is it that the Arab civilizations fell into decline, basically around the 18th and 19th centuries?
Yeah, so oikophobia isn't the only cause behind decline. There are many other reasons. This is also something I mention in the book a bit, that I'm not writing a sort of total history of how civilization develops and declines. There are many, and this is part of the problem with some of the people who engage in this sort of comparative studies, that they all have their sort of little pet cause or pet peeve, and they say it's all about this. And I say specifically that there are many various, many factors, economic and geological, sometimes ecological. It could be all different kinds of reasons why a civilization declines, pestilence, natural disasters, all different kinds of things. But that oikophobia, as we studied, as we studied in the West, tends to be one of those factors, certainly, that plays a part. When it comes to the Islamic civilization, they never really developed so far as to have oikophobia, as you said, because they were not democratic enough. But it is worth pointing out that some of the famous medieval Islamic philosophers, in many cases, did not actually take their religion all that seriously. And that's another thing. Religion tends to the collapse, or not necessarily collapse, but at least the decline of religion is another factor behind oikophobia, because religion is so strongly tied to the roots and to the traditions of a society. And so if the religion declines, the support and the belief in the traditions, including the non-religious traditions of that society, tend to decline concomitantly. And so it's not a coincidence that the biggest oikophobes also tend to be non-religious, and that other things being equal, the more religious a person is, the less oikophobic they tend to be. And some of those Islamic philosophers did not take their religion very seriously, and that's probably part of what enabled them to become the interesting thinkers that they were. But in the case of why Islamic civilization collapsed, I think it's important to remember that there was never any such thing as a unified Islamic civilization. Just like there's no such thing as a unified Western civilization. Different Western countries have declined at different times and at different rates, as I think we also see today. And so that's part of it. They also had the misfortune of getting into the cyclical part, or into the declining part of their cycle as the West was rising. And so the fighting between Islam and Christianity, is the defining feature, really, of European and Middle Eastern history for 1,000 years. And so the Christians, there are many reasons one can study why the Christians prevailed in that struggle, at least at the time. And I do think that a use of reason and a fairly open intellectual space were parts of why the Christians ultimately proved victorious, because they had more room for innovation, more room for new ideas to rise to the top, as opposed to an Islamic culture which was ruled much more from the top down. By which we see, by the way, that of course one is not against an open intellectual space. An open intellectual space is, of course, a wonderful thing in many ways, and we all here, of course, have benefited from that. It's just that nothing is black and white, and it also tends to have this deleterious effect as well.
Mm-hmm. So, what is it that maintains a healthy intellectual space? This this notion that prosperity opens the door to kind of ultimately destructive luxury beliefs, if you will. What is it that actually keeps a society vigorous and resistant to oikophobia? And you do make the distinction in the book that there's a difference between reflective self-criticism of your own society versus oikophobia. I wonder if you could elaborate on not only those differences, but what it is you think keeps societies from sliding into oikophobia, or at least delaying the onset of it.
Mhm. I would say probably delaying rather than stopping it completely. But what delays the slide into oikophobia is mainly, I think, religion and a strong sense of a family. I think those are the biggest things. This sort of hyper individualism and sort of atomization of society, they all go hand in hand with oikophobia, as does the entitlement mentality as well. So I think a strong family, an emphasis on the family as the most important social unit, as opposed to the individual as the most important social unit, I think is a big part of it. And there's a reason why the strongest resistance to Western oikophobia is here in the United States as opposed to Western Europe, because here we still have more religion. It depends, of course, very much on where one is in the country, but by and large, we're still a more religious people. I say this as a non-religious person myself, but by and large, we are a more religious people than most Europeans are, certainly Western North Europeans. And so that certainly helps. It certainly works as a bulwark against oikophobia. If we look at the ancient world, I mentioned that we see oikophobia in both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Greece had a bit more of it than Rome, and Rome had a bit less of it because, and this goes to the same point, that the Romans, by and large, they had a stronger patriarchal sense, a stronger sense of hierarchy. Not to stereotype too much, but the Greeks were a bit more sort of free for all, more fluid, if you will, in their intellectual movements and so on. Whereas the Greeks were about virtue and so on, and the Romans are about strength and manliness. Obviously vast generalizations, but by and large, those are sort of key words in their cultures, if you will. And that's one of the reasons why we have less oikophobia in Rome than in Greece, because this idea of hierarchy, of family, of manliness, and so on, anti-androgynousness, although one also does see androgyny develop in Rome as well. But those sort of attitudes work against oikophobia. Whereas an increase in androgyny and in hyper-individualism, they go together with oikophobia, basically. So that's sort of how to avoid the slide, or to delay the slide. I think you were also asking, let's see, did I miss something there?
Well, you mentioned a number of things in your book, and you've
how to distinguish, I think, between self-critique. Sorry, right.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's difficult to draw that distinction, and I say so because even something that we like, that we think of as something positive, will sort of serve as a stepping stone to a full-blown oikophobia. But certainly one distinction is that I basically talk about three phases, three sort of paradigmatic phases, if you will. One is this initial, very xenophobic and self-promoting phase, where one simply takes for granted that one's own civilization is the best. And then the sort of middle phase, where one still has a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of self-promotion, but it's based on comparative study. One has compared oneself to other civilizations, and one thinks that one's own is actually very good. And then this sort of knee-jerk reaction in the last phase, where it's simply assumed that other civilizations are at least as good as or better than one's own civilization. And this sort of measured critique, coupled with gratitude for the good things that one has, I think gratitude is a big part of it. Understanding that one can criticize certain aspects of one's culture, but that one is still grateful for the many good things that one has from it, would be a hallmark of self-critique, whereas the sort of knee-jerk assumption that whatever is wrong in the world is America's fault or the West's fault, that's where we talk about oikophobia. It's a bit of a spectrum. Sometimes it's a sliding scale. Of course, what's oikophobic to one person might not be quite so oikophobic to another. And I do say in the book that because this is somewhat subjective, it's difficult to say exactly in every case, this is oikophobia and this is not. But the point is that we see this sort of development toward more and more extreme forms as the society declines in its historical trajectory. So,
yeah, you mentioned, well, there was a quote that stood out for me from chapter 11 of your book, and the title of that chapter is "Confluence of the West." And let me just quote here. It is with every passing day more and more the case that all of the West is tottering under the weight of its oikophobia malaise. Now, the question I'm wondering is, to what extent is this kind of a force of nature? You know, you mentioned that there's kind of a progression through the stage from, genuine reflective self-criticism tempered by gratitude versus what seems to be the spread of self-loathing amongst our students today, our culture for that matter. And what's driving that? I can't escape from a parallel with the sciences, for example. You know, if you look at the amount of money that is poured into the sciences, you see that it's been increasing exponentially since 1950, when we began this experiment of federal funding of science. And with that has come a kind of oikophobia in the sciences as well. And of course, scientific research is not the only source of revenues. That's enormous streams of revenue that are flowing into the universities. And one has to ask, to what extent are we subsidizing, tilting our society towards from reflective self-criticism to basically full-blown oikophobia? In other words, to what extent are we subsidizing this? And political subsidies are at root a political act, and they're self-inflicted. And do you think that our generous funding of research and in the universities as well as education is actually fueling the rise of oikophobia in our cultures?
absolutely, I think that's definitely the case, no question. Since our educational institutions themselves are controlled increasingly by the progressives, any funding they receive will automatically be funding for oikophobia. I don't want to generalize too much. You can find certain people who identify as progressives who are more or less oikophobic than others. So they're not. I wouldn't say they're necessarily all oikophobes, but that tends to be the case. And that's actually something that's. This is one thing, though, I like about the United States: the fact that we have such a federalist system. So if you find yourself in Sweden or Germany or one of those places, it's basically any funding for education everywhere is all the same. Whereas at least here in America, we have a certain competition between different intellectual institutions or between different educational institutions, and some of which are more or less oikophobic than others. I mean, what they're doing now in Florida, for example, that they're removing funding for things like critical race theory and that preach the moral turpitude of the United States. I think that actually can create it can create a situation in which there is a certain competition between some public institutions anyway, where less such things are taught, and private institutions where those things do tend to be taught, at least non-religious private institutions like the Ivy Leagues and such. And so I think that's a healthy competition that can exist where the public universities, where people who realize that they don't want those things, they have some place where they can go. But we're certainly funding it. There's no question about that. I think it's quite clear. And this also, you asked, or you mentioned earlier, what fuels this whole thing. The psychological aspect of it is mainly vanity. And since we're talking a bit about universities and education, we have this idea in America that everybody should go to college, which one thing, I'm very pro-American, but one thing I do prefer about certain European countries, especially Germany, where I received most of my own university training, they still have the idea that the university is a privilege and not a right. And they are much more into vocational training, which I think is a good thing, because because the problem with saying that everyone should go to college is that, number one, you stigmatize all the more the people who don't go to college, which is one thing people always, something I mentioned in another talk once. People say, if you don't think that everyone should go to college, that means you think you're better than people who don't go to college. And it's the exact opposite, because if everybody goes to college, then the people who don't, they're the ones who really suffer. They really become the outsiders. Whereas if we understand that privilege, that college is a privilege, and some people who have a certain skill set should do that, and other people who have another skill set, they should go to vocational training or something else, whatever it is they want to do, then we all become much more useful to each other, because the idea of everyone going to college makes everyone into a self-appointed expert. It makes everyone into an intellectual, if you will. And the fact of the matter is that most people don't have the capacity for that sort of thing, and they become vain busybodies, basically, who by dint of their education, I should say pseudo-education, because obviously we live in educationally very devalued times, a result of the fact that everyone has to go to college, because that, of course, lowers the level for everyone. When everyone becomes an expert, when everyone becomes an intellectual, the individual becomes the sole social unit, and it becomes the most important social unit, because one thinks, well, I have all these brilliant ideas, and now I'm going to tell you people how you should lead your lives, and I'm going to explain to you how evil America is, and so on. And so decreasing funding for those things, decreasing funding in public institutions for certain disciplines, and also developing the idea that college is not for everyone, I think would be useful, because it would help in reducing this vanity and this hyper individualism that are fuel for oikophobia.
Yeah. Also mentioned that it does go beyond that. For example, if you this occurred to me while I was reading your book. If you look at the preferred political narrative that happens to be dominant right now, it's towards globalization, it's towards centralization of monetary policy, of economies, centralized decision making now applied at a global scale. That's really setting the seeds for the kind of oikophobic division between the intellectual elites, if you will, and the rest of us, basically. And of course, one of the remarkable things to have happened since 2016 was the emergence, actually it goes further back than 2016, was the emergence of kind of a populist resistance to this, and of course, most notably in the person of Donald Trump and and his followers. And what's your perspective on, for example, the idea of populism as a break against these kinds of oikophobic trends that seem to be playing out so strongly on our globe today at a global scale?
Yeah, I will horrify some of my fellow academics or former academics by saying that I'm actually, my disposition to that populist movement is quite positive, actually. Which is not to say that there aren't certain problems with it. I mean, for example, the sort of cult of personality that has developed around Donald Trump specifically, I don't think is very healthy for sober thinking. But by and large, I'm in favor of it. And this is actually another reason why where my American patriotism once again comes to the fore, because this populist resistance is stronger here, of course, than in any other Western country. One sees it also in Europe, in Western Europe, to some extent, but it's much weaker. Whereas here, there is this sort of, there is a bit of a counterculture, if you will, including an intellectual counterculture, which is something I think we can be quite pleased with. It doesn't mean one has to agree with every aspect of it, but it's good to have that choice. And of course, when you have that broader space, that of course makes it possible for us to have conversations like this one. Whereas in Germany, for example, there you get fined for even just mildly right-wing speech, and similar in France and Sweden and elsewhere. So England, of course, as well. So I think it's by and large a good thing. It's this sort of balance between the two sides. I'm not completely hostile to every form of progressivism, and it's one can easily, saying these things, one can easily be accused of being atavistic and of sort of wanting to go back to some long lost golden age or something like that. That's not the case. There are certain positive aspects one can find with progressivism here and there in specific areas. So I do think a certain balancing act between those two sides is required for society to flourish. But in most of the West today, the progressive side has so completely gotten the upper hand that we've lapsed into oikophobia and other problems. Here we still have that populist resistance, and I think that's a good thing by and large. Yeah.
Is there any way to arrest this on a global scale?
I don't think there is, to be perfectly honest. I am on a global scale, probably not. Well, the one way to arrest it on a global scale, but that's not a solution that I think anybody desires, would be such as through a major war with China or something like that, because obviously that's something that would make a lot of people sort of rally together. And one sees this, of course, on a smaller scale. We had this, these internal divisions about judicial reform in Israel, for example, and obviously something very germane right now. And because of this attack a week ago, this very barbarian attack, Israeli society is more united and patriotic than ever. And something similar could happen on a larger scale in the West as a whole if some development like that were to take place. Of course, I don't hope that that's the case, obviously. Barring that, it's difficult to see how on a global scale such a thing can be arrested. I am more optimistic about on a local level. And there, once again, I would come back to the United States and say that here, at least, we have communities where such a thing is possible. Whereas, for example, in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, everyone pretty much thinks the same. It's something I've written about elsewhere, the fact that there's a much smaller room of possible opinion in many of those West European countries, which is not the case here. So, yeah.
Yeah. I see some questions are starting to stream in here. Thank you for those. We're going to be talking for a little bit longer between us, but please do put your questions in. Okay, so just turning to a kind of a nebulous kind of idea or broadly theoretical idea, your notion that civilizations go through this progression where each subsequent stage, the seeds of each subsequent stage is set by the previous, and these appear at the time to be very nice things, like the opening of free inquiry, acceptance of other civilizations into your polity, and so forth. Your thinking has been compared to an evolutionary biologist friend of mine, Peter Turchin, who has this elaborate mathematical model for cycles of civilization, where they go through periods of ascendancy and ultimate decline. And this comes from basically things like complexity theory and analysis of historical records and so forth and so on. You're not really positing a historical cycle theory, are you? And how would you differentiate what you're talking about from the kind of thinking that goes into Peter Turchin's notion? And incidentally, there's a link to Peter Turchin's Wikipedia page. He calls it cliodynamics. How does your thinking differ from Peter Turchin's?
By a couple of different aspects. So first of all, I think he's more holistic, and he's also focused more on the, I think, more on the economic aspect of things, whereas I am focused much more on culture and philosophy, because that's what I am. Or I mean, I'm a philosopher. But that's one, I guess that's one aspect. I would say probably he's more similar to probably to someone like Spengler in that sense. Now, Spengler, of course, himself is very much focused on culture to a fault. My problem with Spengler is that he thinks everything is explainable through culture, essentially. But maybe the similarity there to some extent is that they both take a sort of holistic view, and they sort of say that this is how things have to happen. I have been accused of being a historical determinist, which, I mean, it's not entirely. I am to some extent. I am fairly deterministic, shall we say? But I don't say that things must happen in such and such a way. I think there's when one is too confident about what exactly will happen and when exactly it will happen, one sort of tends to slip into pseudoscience a bit, as I see it. Although I do believe, which is not to say that one is always wrong, of course, I do believe, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not an expert on Peter Turchin's work by any stretch, but I do believe he said that the 2020s were going to be a period of turmoil or something like that, and which, considering how things are developing, doesn't seem entirely inaccurate, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So one can, I'm not against predicting the future. I do a little bit of prediction myself in the book as well, and maybe on a bit more of a modest level, but I would say those are some of the differences. There is certainly a cyclical element in my work, although I would call it more helical than cyclical, as I explain in the book, because it's not that everything is the same in every cycle. In fact, with every cycle, the oikophobic phenomenon becomes more extreme. And that's because we have even an even freer intellectual space and an even greater degree of democratization with every iteration of that phenomenon. As history develops, we have more democracy and egalitarianism today than they did in ancient Athens. And so it stands to reason that we have more oikophobia, or more extreme degrees of oikophobia as well, than they did. Rome is really, from a chronological point of view, Rome is really the only point where one iteration was slightly weaker than the previous one. The Romans, as I mentioned before, had slightly less oikophobia than the Greeks. But after that, with every new iteration, we see it becomes more and more extreme every time. So I guess I would say I take a helical view in that sense. But it's still fairly cyclical, yeah. So I would say there are certainly similarities, no question about that, between me and someone like Turchin, also, and as between me and someone like Spengler or even Arnold Toynbee, though I have my issues with them as well. But I would say I'm just much more focused on the philosophical and cultural aspect of things. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned Richard Dawkins a while ago, and the kinds of models that Peter Turchin, for example, represents, as well as most of modern evolutionary biology, as exemplified by the kind of gene-centered theory of evolution that Richard Dawkins promotes. To me, the most striking absence there is the presence of agency and intentionality and those kinds of what would be regarded as spooky concepts by the scientific rationalists. And one of the things, of course, that attitude does is it removes the concept of agency from not only evolutionary history, but also the history of civilizations as well. And this slide from healthy self-criticism into oikophobia seems to me to be a manipulation of agency. In the universities, I still find lots and lots of scientists who adhere to the basic tenets of the scientific way of thinking, that is objectivist, rationalist, evidence-based, and so forth. And they're finding themselves increasingly isolated and marginalized in their universities. So what's really going on there is you're kind of demoralizing a group of agents who could take control of their destiny if they weren't so demoralized. And is it the case in your thinking that agency has actually formed a crucial role, not only in the genesis of oikophobia, but also in the resistance of it, to keep a culture in its confident, rationally self-critical stage?
Yeah, so I actually think that it's a double-edged sword, as so much else, and this is why it's sometimes difficult. This is why, as we said before, I don't speak so much about being hostile or friendly to a particular phenomenon, because everything is a double-edged sword. But this sort of rationalistic view. Now, obviously, if we take Richard Dawkins, of course, this sort of we might say hyper-rationalistic view certainly does remove agency. This is actually why I write the epilogue in Western Self-Contempt, the final part, where I explain that even though we see that history does tend to be quite deterministic, or it tends to develop in a particular way, we still have the capacity to do something. And I don't believe in free will. I guess we're getting now into certain part of philosophical territory. I explain I don't believe in free will. I think free will is an illusion. But one of the common misconceptions about the free will question among non-philosophers, at least, is that if there's no free will, then there's no responsibility and no agency, and that's not the case. That's a fairly modern idea that has become very ingrained in the popular consciousness, but in fact, there is no necessary link between free will and responsibility and agency, which is something I tried to explain in the in the epilogue. And so even if one does say, like someone like Dawkins does, that there is no such thing as free will, or I think at least or actually maybe he doesn't say that. Maybe I'm being unfair now. But anyway, many sort of hyper-rationalistic scientists do say this, that there's no such thing as free will. Even if they happen to be right, as I do think they are on that particular point, they draw an erroneous conclusion from it, namely that there is no agency and that we're all just sort of bound to go where we go. And that's explained in some detail from a philosophical point of view in the epilogue. But the problem with people like Dawkins, and he does receive quite a bit of criticism in the book, is that they believe that rationalism excludes religion, which in fact it does not. They don't understand, even though they call themselves scientists, but they don't understand what reason is. There is the ancient conception of reason as logos, which is much broader than our own conception of reason, which includes a certain virtue and connection in the universe and so on. But reason in the modern sense, and this is how they use it, is a tool. Reason is a way of performing a particular action. You can do something rationally, or you can do something irrationally. Reason is a system of inference. But these people like Dawkins and Steven Pinker and others that I criticize in the book, they think that believing in God, for example, is irrational. And they believe that, or that supporting nationalism or whatever it may be is irrational, but it's not. It's simply a belief. Believing in God is neither more nor less rational than not believing in God. These are beliefs, and that's not what reason is about. And so they have abused reason, and these hyper-rationalists have abused reason for oikophobic ends and for anti-traditionalist ends, very much in line with the Enlightenment figures like Voltaire and Rousseau and such people, who believed that reason points in a particular socio-political direction, but it does not. Reason is simply a question of inference. And so one can have all these various beliefs while still being perfectly rational. And I think that it's this. What is also, of course, ironic is that this emphasis on reason, as opposed to religion and tradition and so on, leaves the room open for oikophobia to come in and for postmodernism in science to establish itself, which is ultimately contrary to the views of the scientists themselves. Because if you're engaging in natural science, you believe that there is such a thing as truth, and it's your job as a scientist to find it in your particular field. But if postmodernism establishes itself in science, of course, then there's no such thing as truth, and science itself begins to decline. And so they, by doing what they do, by emphasizing this hyper-rationalism, they are actually noxious to their own ends. You know?
Yeah, and it's a very narrow way of thinking about the world. You know,
Yes.
Among other things, it doesn't take into account that, you know, maybe life is a unique phenomenon that's different from physics and chemistry. You know, it might be based in those physical worlds, but nevertheless, you know, it seems to be a distinctive phenomenon compared to, say the combining of hydrogen and oxygen into water, and of course that's where the exclusion of agency comes in, and you know, maybe we just haven't learned how to think about what free will is. You know, Richard Dawkins has probably said things that support every possible point of view, because he's that
Right.
he's that kind of he's that kind of polemicist. But you know, the removal of agency from anything that is involved with living things, and of course this includes human civilizations, as you said, ultimately leads to a kind of deterministic and almost a totalitarian end. And could you elaborate on that a little bit? You know, this necessary connection between oikophobia and the loss of agency and the rise of totalitarianism.
Yes, well, I don't think that there is a necessary connection between oikophobia and the loss of agency, although certainly they tend to correlate, if you will. And especially what you said before, that it's a very simplistic way of viewing the world. That's something with which I couldn't agree more. They have such a childish view of, first of all, of what religion is and of what social bonds entail. I mean, religion is so much more than they think that religion is just a belief in a magical man in the sky or something. Such a incredibly juvenile way of looking at religion. Religion has a supernatural element, but they confuse religion with magic, which are two different things. Something that Durkheim, for example, talks about a lot, and I wish some of them would read just a little bit of Durkheim. Religion is community, and a religion is a sense of the sacred. And once you have a sense of the sacred, with the sense of the sacred comes a certain sense of gratitude for that which is special and for that which is apart. And that's something that's a great bulwark against oikophobia to have. Because gratitude, if you believe that there is a creator and if you believe that there is something sacred, you are grateful for the sacred, you are grateful for the creation. Whereas if one does not believe those things, then of course it's much easier to be ungrateful for everything that one has. When it comes to agency in particular, if one believes, and again, I want to emphasize that there's not a necessary connection. Philosophically speaking, I am a nominalist, which is to say, I don't believe in any of in the supernatural. I don't believe in. I do believe that we are matter, and that's it. But most people who do share that belief of mine, they do couple that with a loss of agency, which again is why I write the epilogue to explain why that's a philosophical step that is not at all necessary in any way, and that's is based on a misunderstanding, really, of what free will or of what responsibility and of what agency entail. But certainly, it's a bit of a contradiction, because a lot of the oikophobes, they tend to be very progressive as well, and they tend to feel that they want to hurry along the progression of society. So in that sense, they act as if they have agency in a certain sense, because they keep agitating for the progression of society. Just like Marx said that, well, it's inevitable that we'll have a communist state, but we can hurry it along through our actions. But on the other hand, of course, they use this supposed lack of agency to excuse all kind of behavior on the part of criminal elements, for example, and by other cultures. For example, when other members of other cultures do something of which we don't approve, they take away the agency from those people and say, well, they're doing this because of Western imperialism or what have you. And that lack of agency, that loss of agency, is certainly easier to insist upon if religion has collapsed, and if we have replaced religion with a sort of hyper rationalism, which thinks that it's more rational than religion. Yeah.
Before we open up the floor to questions, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the sciences specifically. And when you're talking about ingratitude, for example, one of the remarkable things I've seen during my career was essentially the rise of what is really ingratitude amongst younger scientists and among science in general. And there's a certain amount of self-loathing that has developed as part of that. And the ingratitude you see manifest most starkly in the spread of cancel culture to historical figures in science, people like Thomas Huxley, Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, William Shockley, who in spite of what you think of them as personally as human beings, they made incredible contributions to our advancement of our understanding of the world. And there's this tendency that we have to just erase all that. And of course, part of that is the rise of a certain amount of tribalism, identity politics in the sciences. Even, well, it's spread through the entire scientific ecosystem, even independent professional societies, for example, have bought fully into this. And this to me stands as an example of the way in which subsidizing ingratitude is actually ultimately destructive. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the rise of oikophobia, or what role oikophobia and the emergence of that has in the sciences generally. You have some thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. Of course, you probably know more about that than I do. I wouldn't be surprised as a scientist yourself. But from what I've seen anyway, as an outsider, I mean, if you're speaking specifically of the natural sciences, what I see as an outsider is the sort of, as we said, the rise of postmodernism in science, and the fact that the collapse of truth, which is the whole point of science, I believe, to try to get at it and to reach new horizons through the understanding that there is something that is established out there that is greater than we ourselves are, and then we just sort of have to find it through scientific means. And of course, the abuse of science one sees everywhere. I mean, the notion now that there are 17 genders or whatever it is, science will, of course, will bend to oikophobia and to, in this case, the androgyny of declining cultures, as I mentioned before. And so science is of course, for a while, maybe 20 years ago, was popular to say that the sciences would be immune to the affliction in the humane and social sciences, and of course that has proven not to be the case, unfortunately.
Yes.
And so that's certainly a part of it. How it expresses itself in the natural sciences in detail, I'm probably not qualified to say, but it seems to be similar, from what I can tell, to how it expresses itself in the humane and social sciences. The fact that one basically starts to come up with whatever nonsense one can think of in order to get the funding for whatever is the prejudice of the day, seems to me to be all pervasive.
Yeah, the question for the sciences, again, coming down to this notion that oikophobia in the sciences is a choice, and it's furthermore a choice that's biased by subsidies. The big challenge, I think, is how to empower people who are still confident in the basics of what science is, and versus the rising power of those who want to actually bring a postmodernist tilt to science. And we're not quite sure how to do that yet. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
well, I mean, I think a lot of people need to understand is that science is not a goal. Science is a way of doing things. But if you think of science as an object, or if you think of science as a goal, well, then the goal can be whatever you decide. Now, I said before that the science, of course, is a way of getting at the truth. Of course, in that sense, it's the pursuit of a goal. But if you think of science as if you think of science as a goal, indeed, then whatever your prior goal is, then science is going to serve that particular purpose. We have to start thinking about science much more, and maybe I suppose this goes for certain scientists as well, specific scientists who do these things, but also in the popular consciousness, we have to start thinking of science as a verb, so to speak, as opposed to a noun, and say that one can perform an action scientifically. Just like I said before about reason, one can draw a correct or an incorrect inference, but reason itself doesn't dictate a goal. So to science itself, it doesn't dictate necessarily. I mean, everything, of course, is temporary or provisional in sciences, because perhaps new evidence will reveal new things. well, maybe not everything, but many things. And if we think of science as an activity and as a verb rather than as a goal, I think that might perhaps be a bit helpful in reducing the abuse of science for particular sociopolitical ends.
Yeah, and of course, in at least in evolutionary biology and in biology in general, the distinction between noun and verb is actually a very, very troubling one. The very concept of the organism, for example, by calling something an organism, you're basically making it an object rather than the process that it really is. And if you want to penetrate into the details of how evolution actually works, you can't avoid process. And yet our entire structure of evolutionary biology seems to be centered around object-oriented thinking, genes, organisms, etc., rather than the kind of process that they actually are. Okay,
that sounds very Heraclitean, which with which I would agree. Yes, everything.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. No man goes into the same river twice.
Exactly. One of my favorite philosophers.
Yeah, and mine too. Yes. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A. Thank you to those who have put questions in there. Let's start with Larry right here. He says, I recall a quote that civilizations aren't murdered, they commit suicide. And he asks, is oikophobia also primarily an internal to the civilizational phenomena, or are there significant external influences as well? And you kind of hinted at that in your remarks earlier.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's mainly internal, in which and to that extent the metaphor of suicide is a correct one. It's certainly stimulated by contact with the external, right? There can be no oikophobia because if one has not, as I mentioned before, incorporated come into contact with and absorbed certain external elements, because there has to be something against which one compares oneself. But having said that, it is mostly a development of domestic intellectual movements that leads to oikophobia. One sees the reverse a little bit in non-Western oikophobia. I mentioned a couple of examples. I mean, we spoke about Namibia before. So the sort of very typical oikophobia one sees in many African communities is almost entirely external, because they did not develop these sort of intellectual movements that we had in Europe and North America, but by coming into contact with the colonizers and with the Western external, they come to disdain their own traditional culture because they see all these amazing things that Westerners have that they don't have. And so there's a segment of tribal populations in, for example, Namibia and other African countries that starts to disdain their own tribal village life and their own traditions, because they've gone to the capital city and they've driven cars and gone to movie theaters and so on. So that sort of non-Western oikophobia is much more a question of external forces. But our own Western oikophobia, which is the most common kind, of course, that does tend to be, even though, again, it's stimulated by the external, it's more the result of internal domestic movements.
Yeah, you mentioned the external oikophobia, which is certainly an interesting take on this. And, I spent a fair bit of time in Namibia as well. And one of the things that I've noticed there is that, particularly in terms of development and energy policy, they're still, even though, for example, the government of Namibia is a liberation government, it's ostensibly a communist government, although it's more like the Chinese Communist Party. They still are allowing their policies to be dictated by Western preferences. And in this case, it's what we call a kind of green colonialism. And of course, in the case of Namibia, they have enormous resources in terms of energy, fossil fuels, uranium, and so forth. And they're allowing their energy policies to be dictated basically by the Global Climate Fund and other kinds of agencies like that. And it bespeaks to a similar kind of lack of self-confidence, I think, that somehow their governments, to do the responsible thing, have to listen to Western thought and so forth. And that to me is one of the real tragedies of Africa right now, really, is that, enormous talent, enormous resources. There should be no reason why Africa is poor, and yet they allow themselves to continue to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to another question. Jack Budney, who is often a guest here. Hello, Jack. He asked, would you care to comment on the idea that society behaves under laws, i.e., like those of, or e.g., like those of thermodynamics, with a balance between xenophobia and oikophobia, and when one of the two traits dominates, and a society either grows or declines into a better or a lesser, or at least a different society. And he says, but when there's an equilibrium, the society self-destructs. I'm taking this perspective from Erwin Schrödinger in his essay, What is Life? And I'm sure you ran into Schrödinger, you've dealt with Schrödinger's writings.
Yes. So I'm a bit skeptical toward that sort of language. One finds it also, one finds it a bit here and there, like Brooks Adams was a fairly early example of, if I remember correctly, he does specifically use this sort of terminology. And what I don't like about it, I'm not saying there is no truth to it, but what I don't like about it is that it tends to be a little too rigid, I think, in its analysis. And it kind of closes itself off. What I try to do is to look as much as possible without this sort of terminological baggage, just really look at what people do, and that's it. What do they say, what do they write, and so on, without squeezing that into a particular model. And that's too much of the problem with Spengler as well, for example. He has this model and then everything has to fit it, and which causes him to make a number of mistakes and say things that aren't just true, or to say things that might be true, but that are purely speculative. And so that's why I'm a bit skeptical of that. I think it's better if we want to. I think it's better to have a level of analysis that is as nominalistic as possible. That is to say, that tries to kind of move away from the realist and scientific baggage and just say, well, what do people do, and then what happens? That's what I try to do in the book. And so. Because one sees, I mean, the dynamic again between these two poles that we've been talking about, it does fluctuate, certainly. But I don't think one can really say that when it reaches this particular point, then that happens, and at this point that happens, and so on. It's I think the development of human societies is a little too complex for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, there's nothing more deterministic than a law, is there? And
yes,
and this is the Jack brings up the notion of thermodynamics, and certainly there are laws of thermodynamics. Physical systems behave according to this, but this doesn't mean that that's all they are. And this is one of the mistakes that I think Erwin Schrödinger makes, and as well as a lot of other of my colleagues, is that they just don't know or haven't thought carefully about how to work the unique properties of living things into a thermodynamic context to actually understand how life, for example, is not determined by thermodynamics, but actually life actually determines thermodynamics. It's the opposite. Well, there's a mutual cause and effect relationship there. Okay, so going on to
one of my critiques of Marx is that he uses the word gazettes all the time. Everything is a law. Everything that he can think of is a law, and that's just not. It's not the right level of analysis, I think.
Yeah, and of course we've seen the consequences of that kind of law-based thinking, haven't we? It's okay. So going on to John Bainbridge, he asks, does the attack on Western culture or civilization from within also entail a rebellion against objective truth and reason as elements of our intellectual heritage? So, in other words, do the two go together, which seems to be the case now with the rise of postmodernism in our intellectual life? And if so, does that make it different from past oikophobias that you described?
So this is this is an interesting question, which is why I spend quite a lot of time on this exact question in the book. So I can't do full justice to it here because it's a couple of chapters. What I basically do in the book is I have one chapter, Oikophobia as relativism, fairly early on, because that happens earlier in history. Oikophobia in the as an expression of relativism, or relativism as an expression of oikophobia is a better way of putting it. That happens already in Greece. And then you have this other guise of oikophobia, which I call then oikophobia as positivism, which of course is the opposite. Positivism in the sense that we can all progress toward a particular goal and that this is the best thing, which is anti-relative. I talk about that a little later in the book because that arises later in history. But what happens, and this is basically the answer to the question, what happens in modern times is that these two streams of oikophobia have come together, even in the very same people, which of course makes them not very philosophically rigorous. But since both of these types of oikophobia have the same goal, they level one's own society and they raise others up. They are an outlet of allophilia as well, right? The love of the other. They are both used concomitantly together, sometimes by different people and sometimes by the very same people who don't notice the philosophical tension between them, in order to achieve their oikophobic ends. And so I would say, so my basic answer to the question is yes, but not exclusively yes. There is also the other kind. Yeah, but it is an interesting question because they arise differently in history, but are used for the same goal, even though they're philosophically opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is one of the most interesting things about your book, which is the way you actually look at this diversity of civilizations and the similarities and differences in this course from xenophobia to oikophobia. All right, so Dave Peterson, next question. He asked, "What's the course of oikophobia? What comes after?" Which I think is probably the most germane question right now, because you've spoken about the typical course, or well, not typical, but the various courses from xenophobia to oikophobia. What comes after? Can a culture survive it, he asks.
Right, yeah, so this is one of several reasons why we are lucky to live in the modern era. When you have roving barbarian tribes everywhere, as in the ancient world, what comes after oikophobia is something like the Middle Ages after the collapse of Rome, for example, or the fall of the Greek city-states and so on. So those are all very unpleasant things, of course. Nowadays, because we are not surrounded by barbarian tribes, certainly not here in the United States anyway. When oikophobia leads to a sort of cultural degradation, we're not suddenly going to be invaded by Mexico or Canada, of course. So in that sense, we're lucky. So what tends to happen to modern Western states when they become oikophobic is simply that they lose power on the world stage. They become historically irrelevant. As Spengler might put it, they sort of exit the historical stage, if you will. So a country like England, which used to rule the world, basically, becomes just a backwater. It doesn't. I mean, England is a nice enough country to be in. It's not a backwater in that sense, but its golden era is over, obviously, and it becomes focused on the very small. And this is another way we can see that oikophobia is more progressed in Western Europe than here in the United States, because in Western Europe, the things they quibble with each other about and that they fight about tends to be these sort of geopolitically and historically irrelevant. Whereas here we argue with each other about larger questions, because here we are declining, but our golden age, if you will, or the peak of our era is not far behind us. And so on our trajectory, we're further back. And so the debates that we have here make a big difference. When a Republican or a Democrat wins the presidency or wins local elections, that makes a real difference in people's lives, which is not the case really whether the so-called right or the left in Europe win. It doesn't really change anything, because they all think the same thing, because they have exited their historical stage, if you will. Now, the point about roving barbarian tribes, that is, of course, less dramatic today, but one does see it, of course, to some extent in the sort of unlimited immigration that takes place to a lot of European communities. Now, that's not, of course, as dramatic as Rome being overrun or anything like that. But it is a similar theme in the sense that if the French, for example, no longer believe in their own culture, they do believe very much in the culinary aspect of their culture, but that's about it. If they don't believe that there's anything worth preserving, well, then it doesn't really matter who lives there and who doesn't. And so in that sense, we see what comes after oikophobia, in the sense that multiculturalism comes after oikophobia. And this, of course, was a big problem in Rome as well, multiculturalism toward the later parts of the empire. Multiculturalism becomes after oikophobia, and that, of course, or not after, together with oikophobia, but then that leads to a weakening of the state as well, because one can't agree on anything anymore. One agrees on the politically, one agrees in the sense that one has political debates about the irrelevant, but in terms of what the ideals, what the cultural what the ideals and principles of a civilization should be, they become irrelevant. They become watered down, and so that's basically what happens. So a country the civilization sort of can continue to trudge along, but it becomes certainly geopolitically irrelevant.
Yeah. This ties into the next question from anonymous attendee. If you have any thoughts on how a society comes to be originates having to do with national pride as opposed to oikophobia, and some of your comments just now sort of feed into that. Do you have pride in your own culture even when confronted with or even assimilating large numbers of people who have not come up in your culture? Any thoughts?
Does one or do I personally?
I think you can answer that in any way you like.
Yeah, well, right.
Yeah.
Well, there is a certain, I'm not sure if that's the question. There is a sort of something which I also talk about a little bit in the book, and somebody on the left criticized me for not talking about this, who hadn't read very carefully, because it's definitely in there. But in any case, the sort of reactionary oikophobia when the right wing or the conservatives become very hostile to what they perceive their society has become through an influx of foreigners and other cultures, and so they lose pride. I think that's the question the person is asking. They lose pride in their society because of what is happening to it. And this is actually interesting. I mean, I'm an immigrant myself, obviously, so I'm not against immigration just in general. I think it's a question of what kind of immigration we have. But as an immigrant, I came to this country for the first time in the mid-90s as a teenager, and I noticed that in those days, it was only the left that was outraged if one said that America is the greatest country in the world, whereas the right would say, yes, of course we are. Whereas nowadays, if one says to certain segments anyway of the right that we're the greatest country in the world, they are equally outraged because they perceive America to have declined to such an extent through the influx of other cultures and through androgyny and oikophobia and so on, that they are outraged by the idea that we would be the greatest country in the world. And I think that's also important to guard against, because I think the right, not all of it, but certain segments of it, it's not all of the left either, of course, but I think certain segments of the right now are turning into the monster that they are fighting, because they lose their gratitude as well. I was speaking to a family member of mine a while ago about after the Supreme Court had struck down affirmative action. And we said, well, this is a good thing because, because we're against affirmative action. We think race should not be a factor in hiring decisions and so on. And so I said, well, we talk about American decline a lot, but here we see something in which we've actually had an improvement. Isn't that nice? And this family member of mine, who's very much on the right, he makes me look like a commie. He said basically, he said that, yeah, well, that doesn't matter. People are going to ignore it anyway, and so on. So basically, this hostility toward the idea of saying that there's anything good, of being grateful toward anything that we have here in America, I think that's an attitude one has to guard against, and one has to be grateful for what we have, knowing all the while that it's not perfect. Because of course that used to be a very left-wing and progressive thing. The fact that they could point at certain faults that we have and that are undeniable, therefore everything is bad. That of course is not the case. I hope I've answered the question, but I think so. I think the pride in one's country and patriotism, I think that's still very much called for. Yes, it goes along with
yeah. This transition. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the phrase "dissent is patriotism" to where we are right now, which is right. dissent is seditious and treasonous, yes, almost. Exactly. Jack Budney comes back with a really interesting question. I know you spoke about civilizations, mostly in Western and I have to confess, I don't recall whether you spoke about American civilizations. And so he asked, what happened to the Aztec civilization? And I imagine the same kind of thing can be extended to the Maya and also the Inca, those great fragile civilizations in South America and Central America.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Did you
Yeah,
write about
I
that?
don't talk about them in the book.
Okay.
Yeah, so but I don't think they got to the point where Oikophobia would have been possible.
Hmm.
They were too early on, still in their civilization or in their development. I mean, they weren't all the same, of course. Some of them were more or less developed than others, which enabled some of them to conquer others. I mean, such as the Aztecs. But no, I don't believe there was any such thing there. I mean, there was not enough of a literate culture,
Hmm.
not enough of an intellectual culture. I mean, they collapsed because the Europeans arrived, basically. Not to put too fine a point on it, but
You think that as they expanded and became more powerful, that they would have been on this trajectory towards oikophobia? This is
not
speculative
really.
history,
I
I
mean,
know.
yeah, I think a lot more. I mean, considering the state of development they were in when the Europeans arrived, they would have needed a lot of time, I think, to reach that point, because they were. I mean, they. Yeah, I should. I mean, I'm not an expert on Aztec culture, but
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
but I don't think. I think several centuries more would have been required, probably.
Okay. All right. All right. So Thomas Jociewicz, I hope I pronounced your surname correctly there, Tom. He asked a question about religion. He asked, would a revived Christianity, with its traditional creed and morality tempered by charity and humility, serve to turn us away from this fairly deterministic and grim understanding of our cultural and national fate?
Yes, I think so. And this is. And again, one can say this also as a non-religious person, as I am, but there's no question. Even now, I can say, I mean, the people that I get along with best, on a personal note, are religious people, because they are the ones who tend to have gratitude and who haven't lost themselves in hedonism and nihilism and so on. Religion definitely is the greatest. Of course, now there are certain churches, for example, that have become very oikophobic or woke, as we would say, and that sort of cater to the most extreme excesses of the progressives. They do exist, but by and large, other things being equal, certainly religion is certainly something that would help. Yes, which is again why we have less. Why oikophobia is less widespread here, although it is quite extreme where it does exist. It is extreme, but it's still less widespread here in the United States than in Europe. I mean, in Sweden, I mean, Sweden is an atheist country. Practically everyone there is an atheist, and they have completely abandoned the idea of a sort of a national culture, of a Swedish culture.
Okay, that's been fueled by a considerable amount of immigration,
Yes.
hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Randy Wayne, our friend, he asked a kind of a very broad question. He asks, can you explain how one who is nothing but matter can have agency? Since matter does not have agency, how does the agency emerge? So this is getting into one of those deep philosophical questions. If agency exists, where does it come from? If
It
we're
doesn't come from
materialists.
anywhere. Yeah. So, and this is something I talk about at length in the epilogue. So the idea of I give a sort of a brief history of free will in the epilogue as a sort of prelude to this discussion of this question about how free will developed and so on. And obviously agency, the idea of agency and responsibility existed long before the idea of free will in the history of ideas. But agency exists in the sense that, now this is going to sound very reductive, and that's not how it's meant. And that's why I wrote a lengthy epilogue to explain why it's not reductive, or in part to explain that. But basically, if you prick yourself on a thistle or something like this, you're not going to like that thistle. You're going to remove it from you. So you might like a rose because it smells nicely and it's beautiful, even though supposedly the rose did not have agency in being the way it is. Agency is something that simply comes from how we interact with each other in the world. There are things we perceive as positive and things we perceive as negative, and agency comes from that. whether we freely chose to do what we do is not necessary for agency to be established. Already David Hume says this explicitly, actually, in a treatise of human nature. He waffles a bit, actually, on the question. I guess he's a little worried about what people might say, but it's not a novel idea. Which is why then Kant, of course, who was rather alarmed by this and started doing his whole thing with the Critique of Pure Reason and everything. But agency itself is simply a practical result of what happens in the world, and it doesn't really need to come from anywhere, if that makes sense. Again, I know it sounds reductive, like we're just it's like we're plants or something like that, which is not how we are. Obviously, we're more than plants. We're more than animals, and this is again where a lot of oikophobes go wrong, and they think that these metaphors mean that we really are nothing but animals, which of course is not at all what I think. But that is basically agency.
Yeah. We're approaching the close of our time, so I apologize if we didn't get to everyone's question, but I'd like to close on one question. This is from Larry. He says, I'm curious about the cognitive dissonance aspect. For example, in recent days in particular, I've watched members of the LGBTQ community come out in vocal support of Hamas, an organization that, to put it mildly, does not approve their lifestyle. How far can this sort of ignorance of reality extend to satisfy a need to hate your own society?
Yeah,
provocative
yeah,
question.
Yes, I love the gays for Palestine is my favorite. I think they would be executed immediately if they went there. They would have to go to Israel right away, where they could live in peace. So yeah, I mean, cognitive dissonance is a generous way of putting it. Most of it, I think, it's simply ignorance, but of course it is fueled by oikophobia. If one hates one's own society, one is, of course, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. One is going to naturally, if you will, ally with Hamas or any other force that is perceived or that is hostile to the United States, and most of it is simply fueled by ignorance. There is also a certain naivete in the sense that even if one recognizes, one looks at the pictures of decapitated Israeli and Jewish babies and so on, even if one recognizes that, wait a minute, well, they did something bad here. Which at least maybe some of them recognize, one would hope, there is still this idea that, well, they did this because of Israeli occupation, and so it's not really this, which goes back, of course, to the point about agency that we discussed before. I should say, quote unquote, Israeli occupation. It's a whole other discussion, but it's not actually occupation. But anyway, but in any case, one does this because one perceives the Israelis are being aggressive, and so one takes away agency. And the reason I say this is also very narcissistic, because one believes that Hamas and certain other groups, if only left alone, or if only not in this situation, they would think of the world exactly as we do, and they would be welcoming of gays and other people. Which of course is not the case, because an oikophobe tends to be a narcissist because he's not grateful. He thinks he's the best thing there is, and so he thinks that surely everyone thinks as I do, because I'm right about everything. And so one believes that Hamas really has the same ideas as oneself does, only that because of external circumstances they act the way they do. So I think that plays a part in contributing to that cognitive dissonance, and some of it, as I said, is just plain ignorance.
Yeah. Before I give you the last word here, Benedict, let me just close with a few remarks to all of you who submitted questions for Benedict. Thank you very much, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to all of them. Any unanswered questions or questions that come up, if you could just send them to me at my email address here at the National Association of Scholars. That's turner@nas.org. I'll do my best to get you an answer as quickly as we can. And also keep in mind today that our conversation will be posted on YouTube very shortly, and at the NAS website. This will come on very shortly. The links that I discussed today, or that I posted on the chat, I'll put them in the comments section there. And of course, the comments section is another useful place to post questions and comments. And we do monitor those, and I'll try to respond to those as quickly as we can. Finally, I'd like to just put in a plug for the National Association of Scholars. Our sponsors for this webinar is the NAS. If you're a member, thank you again for your generous support. And if you're not yet a member, please do consider joining us. We think we're doing some good work in defending higher education, and we value your help. There'll be a little bit of a hiatus in Restoring the Sciences. We won't be coming on again until November 24th, but I'd just like to put in a plug for some of our other webinars. On Tuesday, 17th of October, we'll have the next installment of our American Innovation webinar series, and this one will be on connecting the world, the internet. And 1 week from today, on October 20th, there'll be a webinar on China's influence in higher education, especially the network of Confucius Institutes scattered throughout our universities. The next time we'll see you on Restoring the Sciences will be on November 24th, and our guest that day will be the MIT climatologist, Richard Lindzen, and I hope we will see you then. And it just remains for me to thank you, Benedict, for being a guest in our webinar. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think our audience has as well. And with that, I will turn it over to you for any last thoughts you might have.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Very nice discussion as well, and I appreciated the questions. I'll be happy to answer more questions. So I guess you said you would have a way of doing so. Otherwise, if you find me online, Benedict Beckeld, I'll be happy to answer any questions across any of my social media as well. So be happy to continue the discussion.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, links to Benedict's website as well as other things will be in the comments section of the YouTube video that will be posted shortly. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Benedict. It was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll bid you all adieu.